Hi, I'm Joseph Radota, author of The Watergate, Inside America's Most Infamous Address, and you are listening to US Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to US Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Today, we go to one of the most cherished vacation spots in America, Cape Cod, Massachusetts, with architect Peter McMahon, Executive Director of the Cape Cod Modern House Trust. And now, here's your host, the only person ever given an athletic award for running a hot dog stand, George Smart.
Hi, folks. It was high school, and there was no way out of this obligation, I thought. All the boys had to play soccer, or basketball, or some other sport involving sweat and balls. It was school policy. At 13, I was not the delightful model of fitness that I am now, so this team sport thing was just not going to cut it. After 2 days of torturous August summer soccer practice, I overheard parents bickering about the school concession stand and how none of them wanted to work it for the coming season 3 days away. So like a bullet, I shot to the principal's office and voila, off the team, serving up hot dogs, drinks, and really awful candy, and eating same while watching my peers play soccer. It was my Olympic moment of athleticism. And yes, the high school did give me an award for it. Speaking of award winners, I am thrilled to have returning to the show as co-host, despite her better judgment, architect Erin Sterling Lewis. Hi, Erin.
Hi, George.
Erin Sterling Lewis, and you know she's very talented because she has 3 names, is a partner in the architecture firm In Situ Studio with Matt Griffith in Raleigh, North Carolina. The firm won at least a dozen state and local AIA design awards, plus 4 George Matsumoto prizes. And their work has been appearing many times in Dwell, Architizer, and other publications. She is past president of AIA North Carolina, and this past year received the AIA Young Architects Award, which is pretty strong for a firm only 8 years old.
Yeah, we like to go ahead and say we're already in our 9th year. As soon as we turn another year, we go to the next one in our vocabulary. It helps a lot. But honestly, we're having so much fun at In Situ Studio. We love all of our clients and the work we have the opportunity to do, and we just hope to keep it up.
Well, thank you for being here.
You bet.
Our announcer and engineer, who we all love, Tom Guild, is back on vacation again, and we thank Cameron for running the dials today. Cameron handles production for our musical guests, and it's great to work with him on the regular show. I think Tom is resting up for US Modernist trip to Palm Springs for Modernism Week in February. Modernism Week is the Super Bowl of mid-century modernist houses, with the best house parties, tours, lectures, furniture, arts, everything. And we will tape at least a dozen interviews for US Modernist Radio poolside at the Hotel Skylark, where the martinis are. We're also hosting our first benefit evening at the Kirk Douglas House, which by the time you hear this is likely going to be sold out. I'm sorry. But there are hundreds of great events during Modernism Week, and you can sign up at www.modernismweek.com.
Support for US Modernist Radio comes from Realtor Angela Roll. In an adventure that we are largely making up, Realtor Angela Roll was the first woman to complete the grueling Navy SEALs program. On a secret mission to England, she infiltrated a royal wedding, but after accidentally spilling a bottle of Chateau Margaux 1787 on someone's mother, who had a crown, her military record became classified and she was burn noticed to Oslo, Norway. Broke, and with only a 9mm Ruger, a circular saw, and a black ball gown to her name, she studied architecture by day and built portable dance floors by night. It was on one of her custom dance floors at the Finnish embassy that she waltzed into the arms of international man of mystery Eric of Helsinki, whom she later married. On their honeymoon aboard the Queen Mary II, she performed the Heimlich maneuver on Frank Gehry, the resulting projectile inspiring a series of artworks by Millie Brown.
Google it.
Today, Angela is a modernist real estate agent with architecture training, advising buyers and sellers of modernist houses on everything from appropriate renovation to how to remove bullet holes from a dance floor. Angela Roll is your special agent. Reach her at angelaroll.com. That's ROEHL or 919-995-0550.
Ah, Cape Cod. That arm-shaped stretch of Massachusetts where Boston goes in the summer. The sun, the clam chowder, the ocean, the traffic, more clam chowder. Oh, I loved clam chowder up there. The summer theater productions. And best of all, except for perhaps the clam chowder, the modern architecture. There are more than 100 modern houses representing a little-known treasure map of residential architecture on Cape Cod. Our guest is Peter McMahon, the principal of PM Design, which is pretty swell since the PM stands for Peter McMahon. Peter's Olympic moment for preservation came in 2006 when he curated an exhibition on Cape Cod modernist architecture for the Provincetown Art Museum. This led to the creation of the unique and, I must say, really highly effective Cape Cod Modern House Trust, which documents and preserves these houses and makes them available for the public. His own summer house in Wellfleet, Massachusetts, right there in Cape Cod, was published in House Beautiful, an Outside magazine, and he is co-author with Christine Cipriani of Cape Cod Modern, Mid-Century Architecture and Community on the Outer Cape. Welcome, Peter.
Well, thank you for having me.
So, how did you discover Cape Cod? Was this late in life or somewhere you went as a kid?
No, actually, every summer of my life, I've been on the Cape, including my first. And then when I was 10, my parents hired a local modern architect, Charlie Zender, to design us a house. So I observed this house going up, and it had a big influence on me getting into architecture. I went to architecture school, and then actually the first house that we leased and restored was by that same architect, Charlie Zender.
So you grew into this. I mean, it was just there all along.
Yes, and my mother was an art historian and did drag me through the great buildings of Europe as a child. So,
so awful.
Although mostly churches and, pre-modern buildings. But as a kid, actually, I used to run around and look at these buildings. And actually, where we lived, there was a Marcel Breuer house around the corner, and there was a number of experimental, mostly 60s buildings in the neighborhood. And as a kid, even as a small kid, I used to walk around and sort of observe them.
So did you know it was modern, or was it just what your mom liked?
Well, she was mostly into the Renaissance and stuff, although she did collect some Danish modern furniture when I was a kid. But no, I was very interested in the shapes. So there was a building right behind us that had this amazing roof made of glue lamps that looked kind of like a big boat overturned. There was a lot of sort of experimental shapes, and people have always taken more chances with their summer house, and these were all built in the mid-20th century, and a lot of the clients were academics or artists and writers. So there was a moment there when people were very experimental with their summer houses, and these were generally not heated buildings, so you could have big areas of glass, and you didn't really need to worry about insulation. So these were, experimental houses, experimental with their forms and their materials and their approach to the landscape, etc.
When did you think about going into architecture? Was it because of that childhood, or was there another motivation for you?
It was mostly that childhood rather than another one. That was a joke.
Good. We like those.
Yes, it was that childhood. And also, as a kid, I had those maple blocks, which are kind of a mainstay of, I don't know, probably modernists everywhere. And I know that Wright had the Froebel blocks. You know, the kindergarten movement in Germany produced these toys that were supposed to stimulate the 3D thinking of children, and Wright was very influenced by these Froebel blocks, and I got the sort of plain maple blocks that were, I think it was Creative Playthings. That was very influential.
Oh my God, I had those blocks.
Yeah, just simple rectangles and arches and columns.
I remember the Creative Playthings logo being stamped on some of them now.
Yes. Yeah, Creative Playthings actually had a huge effect, on that generation, and was very modernist and kind of, Scandinavian modernist in its aesthetic.
Now,
but the idea is that you give kids neutral toys that they have to, that aren't figurative, that they're abstract.
So unlike Barbie, which is very, very defined, or G.I. Joe, these blocks force you to use your imagination to put them together.
Well, you can make a house for the Barbie.
I see. A very Scandinavian modern house.
Right, yes.
Now, Creative Playthings, was that before Legos or after Legos?
I don't know. I mean, I think Lincoln Logs and Erector sets and stuff were, but I'm not sure. It's funny because there's someone here in Wellfleet whose parents were designers for Creative Playthings, and they did a show at the library of, he has this amazing collection of the trucks and the airplanes, and they really are fantastic. I know that some people collect them, but those blocks were really ubiquitous in that generation, and they are really terrific toys for kids.
So you knew from an early age you wanted to be an architect?
Well, I was always kind of fascinated by it, and then actually in the high school I went to, I took 2 semesters of architectural design because there was a teacher there who, it was an artsy school, and there was a painting teacher who'd taken architecture classes, and so I had 2 semesters, and then a lot of my class went to architecture school, so there was some kind of a moment there. A lot of them went to RISD or Cooper Union, and I kind of resisted for a couple of years, and then I went to a regular college, didn't really like it, and then switched to architecture school in Boston, and then worked in offices off and on. I did a lot of furniture design and furniture construction. Although I wasn't in architecture all along, I took some time out and I actually kind of hate the profession, but I love the practice. And so
nobody else feels that way, Peter, I'm sure. No one. It's just you.
I was never a good employee. I was a terrible employee. So I was never really happy until I had my own thing. But that takes a long time to know enough to have your own office.
And so when did you move to the Cape full time?
I actually got laid off right after 9/11 in New York. So I was in the city for about 13, 14 years before that. And there was a big kind of crash after 9/11, and I came to the Cape to do a rebuild of my family's house, which was not the original Charlie's Under house, but my father kind of got that one and lost it to the bank, and then we had another house which was sort of a kit house from the 70s, so I did a pretty extensive rebuild on that, and then I sort of was reluctant to go back to the city because I kind of felt like it was the time. I always liked it on the Cape better than anywhere else. I always felt more at home here, and then two things happened. I got a job, a project, an architectural commission, and then a friend of mine named Bob Bailey, who's a local artist, was curating a show at the Provincetown Art Association about the modern houses in Wellfleet. This was originally supposed to be a sort of photography show of some of the derelict modern houses. There happens to be a lot of sort of derelict vacant modern houses, many of which were owned by the Park Service. And so I co-curated that with him, and I got sort of obsessively started researching and trying to find all of the children and grandchildren of the original architects and clients, many of whom are still around. And that included the Saarinen children, Marcel Breuer's son, the Chermayeff children and grandchildren, Charles Jenks. Just a lot of these people were still around. And some of the original Bauhaus people who came here in the 40s, their children still have connections here. So the son of Zanti Shavinsky, I found, and Juri Kepisch's family were still here living in their Marcel Breuer house. And I think that no one really had a picture of the full scope of how many houses there were here and the extensive community that had existed here back in the woods. And that's one reason why nobody knew, is because it was mostly back in the woods, and even their neighbors didn't know who they were or what they were up to.
Well, Peter, tell us why Cape Cod was so important, or maybe how it became so important for modernist architects. I know that Walter Gropius and Breuer, as you just mentioned, had homes there, among others, but what was the draw?
Well, the Cape during the Depression was very depopulated. There was sort of an economic crash. The fishing industry collapsed, and Wellfleet had only a few hundred people in it, and there were a lot of empty houses. There was already an art colony in Provincetown that from the turn of the century, which is 2 towns over. And then in the Depression, some writers like Edmund Wilson, Mary McCarthy came to Wellfleet and sort of lived in these old farmhouses. And back then there was a train you could take to New York, so they would just hop on the train and go back and forth. And then there were these sort of American bohemians. In the book, we call them the Bohemian Brahmins because they were sort of ne'er-do-well sons of old New England families who had been to Europe and seen modern architecture. None of them had studied architecture, but they came to Wellfleet and either bought or inherited large pieces of land when land was very, very cheap, like $20 an acre.
Wow.
On the Cape. And then they started building these sort of their version of modern architecture, which was very do-it-yourself. And then through friends, they started meeting the European refugees that were coming over in the build-up to World War II. And in 1937, Harvard hired Gropius to come and take over Harvard and consolidate it into the Graduate School of Design. So that's urban planning and landscape and architecture. And so this whole gang comes over in 1937, and that included Moholy Nagy, Breuer, Herbert Bayer, Zanti Shavinsky, and all of these Bauhaus-connected people. And they spent the summer on the Cape, at the foot of the Cape, in this place called Planting Island. And then they kind of all spread out. Breuer and Gropius went to Harvard. Herbert Bayer went eventually to Aspen, but first he curated the first big Bauhaus show at MoMA. Zanti Shavinsky was already teaching in Black Mountain College.
Down here in North Carolina, yep.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, there's a lot of Black Mountain connections with this group. So anyway, these two groups kind of got to know each other, and the Europeans, when they got settled, came out to Wellfleet, invited by these bohemians who had come, American bohemians who were already out here kind of homesteading, and they could buy a piece of 3 acres for very, $500 or less, and they started building experimental summer houses.
And did that coincide with the popularity of Provincetown as a safe place for gay people to go on holiday?
Well, P-Town is like a kind of a parallel story, but it's actually quite a different, it has its own very long and rich cultural history, but it's actually kind of really different. There's crossover, but P-Town, as I say, was an art colony starting at the turn of the century with Hawthorne, Hawthorne's School of Art, and then Eugene O'Neill and the Provincetown Players. So there was a whole scene there. And then, and of course, it was a Portuguese fishing town going, before that. As far as like a gay town, that does go very far back, but I can't tell you exactly when. It's always been a very tolerant kind of melting pot, Provincetown.
And I imagine that there was sufficient interest from all of these different bohemian groups in the new architecture, the new little houses that were going up.
In Provincetown?
Yeah.
It's funny. Provincetown is kind of its own bubble, too. As I say, there's some crossover, but this stuff was going on in the woods in Wellfleet way back, kind of out of anybody's observation. Provincetown is I'm sure you've been there, but it's a sort of it's a little bit of urban fabric, in the middle of nowhere.
Sure.
It's a town, and Wellfleet is very spread out and very rural. So everyone's down at the end of some long dirt road. So it's amazing how little was known of what was going on here.
You mentioned earlier about the National Park Service, and I know this story, but tell our listeners, how did they come up to end owning all these mid-century houses?
Yeah, so the Kennedys really introduced legislation to create the Cape Cod National Seashore in '59, and that was to stop overdevelopment of the Cape post-war. And basically everybody fought about that for 2 years, and it passed in 1961. And there was a total moratorium on new building in the park boundaries, which is like half of Wellfleet is in the park. I think more than half of Truro and a good chunk of Provincetown. So a lot of the Outer Cape is in this national park, and which is why it's so, the natural beauty has been retained, is that you can't build in these in most of the geographical area. But a lot of people started building houses in that 2-year period where nobody knew what was going to happen. They were basically gambling. So when the legislation passed, the Park Service went to those people and bought them out and gave them 25 years, at which point they had to vacate, and the park was planning to demolish all those buildings. The park, being kind of slow and underfunded, never tore down more than a few of them. And some of them lasted long enough to become historic. The park also really didn't have much inkling that any of these buildings were architecturally significant until about 2003 or 4. By then I was already on the scene and starting my research, so we kind of came to a meeting of the minds on that.
So if the legislation went through in 1961, then they had to vacate somewhere around 86.
Mm-hmm.
So between 86 and 2003, 4, 5, they just sat there?
Yeah, not all of them were vacated at the same time because the Park Service initially didn't have enough money to buy everyone out, so there was a sort of rolling buyout, and then some people got special year-to-year permission to stay in the buildings. So it's not quite, cut and dried, but roughly, yes. And then they sat empty. So when I started my research, I started talking to the park's historian, and I said, I know that the park owns some modern houses. Can we go look at them? And so they had a big book binder, and if it had a lot of glass on a flat roof, we would go look at it. And we came up with a sort of an A and a B list of modern houses that were owned by the park. And the idea of starting a nonprofit was basically so that we could apply for leases on these buildings, and then we would have to raise the money to restore them, and then we would relaunch them as a platform for new activity, or we would come up with a new programmatic idea for what these buildings would be.
So how hard was that to persuade the Park Service to let you come in and take over these buildings?
Well, the Park Service was actually originally their idea, because the Park Service doesn't have funding really for buildings. That's not really in their purview. They're in the nature business, and they often partner with nonprofits to deal with existing buildings that come into their ownership. So there are many examples of lighthouses and other buildings owned by the Park Service that nonprofits actually maintain and present to the public.
What was the first house you restored and worked on?
So the first one was the Kugel Gibbs house, designed by Charlie Zender, which had been empty for 11 years. 11 years in this climate is a long time, and they're really, the roofs tend to fail, the, materials, that was before rubber roofing, so they're usually wet and filled with animals and very rotten when we get them. We started with that house, which we restored, and then we got two others, the Hatch house and the Weidlinger house, and we are now working on a fourth house, the Kohlberg house, which is also very rotten. We're just in the process of reframing that, and that will be done this June.
I have to ask this just as a layperson, because I'm not an architect. How do you decide what to fix versus what to replace on these houses that have been sitting with no heat, no air conditioning, water leaks, and animals for a decade?
Well, we actually have to follow the regulations of the Mass Preservation Authority, which dictates that, character-defining features, which are, things which make the building unique, need to be preserved, and that things you can do that enhance the performance of the building that don't show are fine. So if you take down the plaster in a building, you can insulate the walls, although whatever you do has to be removable. So it can't be something that alters the building. So you can't use blow-in closed-cell foam insulation. You have to put batt insulation, which can be removed. So the idea is that it can be brought back to its original state. So in the Kugel Gibbs house, so it's still single glazing because he was very into Frank Lloyd Wright, and there's these windows where the glass just meets in the corner, and you really can't do that with double glazed glass. But we super insulated everything that we could get at, and then a lot of these buildings were very simply constructed with local materials that you could get at the lumberyard. So there's not a lot of exotic materials, which is good. And then wherever possible, we replace it with the same material. There's certain issues like with the Weidlinger house, there's a siding called Weld-Tex, which was a sort of striated plywood made of fir, Douglas fir, and they stopped making it in the early 70s. It was a sort of precursor to Texture 111, but it's much nicer. And the modernist...
I have never heard before what the T in T111 stands for, and you have just opened my eyes. It's texture.
Yes,
okay.
You're welcome. Anyway, it's this cool stuff which the modernists loved because you could use it inside or outside, and because the striations went vertically, you don't notice the joint. And you could make a sort of floating box. It really fit with their aesthetic. The problem is they don't make it, and a lot of it was rotten, so we had to actually find some of this. And there was a restaurant in town that had a stairwell that still had the Weld-Tex in it, so we made a deal with them where we removed it and sheetrocked their stairwell, and we got enough sheets of it to restore the rotten parts. Yeah.
That's a very creative solution.
Yeah, well, this was out of necessity. Philip Johnson did a little house when he was at Harvard called the Thesis House, which is a little courtyard house. And there's a 10-foot wall of Weld-Tex around it. I just went to a colloquium there, and because Harvard has bought it and restored it. And in that case, they actually used computer-aided cutting. They manufactured Weld-Tex from scratch.
So like in a little maker machine, or?
It was a big 3D cutting machine, so like a CNC cutting, basically you feed it through and the computer.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
And can you
cutting.
get Weld-Tex on eBay? Is there a market for it outside of going to scavenge your local restaurant?
Well, apparently someone in California has now started making it because the Eichler houses in California, like that Steve Jobs grew up in,
right?
They are all covered with it. And there's so many people are restoring those that I hear somebody is making it now.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. So there's a lot of challenges, of that sort of where do you find something that's the same or close enough.
Peter, how does the Cape Cod Modern House Trust use the restored homes today?
Well, basically, as I said, we have to raise the money to restore them. So we have relied heavily on the town of Wellfleet. We have something called the Community Preservation Act, and it's a state fund money which is surtax on real estate transactions statewide, and then each community can opt in or out of it. And if you opt in, you can use some of that money for historic preservation. So we applied for all 3 of the houses we've done so far. We've applied to the town for Community Preservation Act money, which has to be approved in town meeting. So I have to go and present this at town meeting, and the majority of the town has to approve. And that was interesting because it was sort of a hill to climb to convince the town some people in town, that these were historic buildings, because some of them were built as recently as 1970. So I think that argument has mostly been won, and the book helped a lot with that, because people are now kind of proud of their modern houses, and it's a big part of sort of the cultural history of the town because of all the people that lived in them. It was a really amazing cultural moment here on the Outer Cape, where a lot of famous political thinkers and writers and academics were the people living in these houses, as well as the architects.
And on that note, I'm curious to know if in your restoration work, how much interaction do you have with former owners or people who are associated with the homes in any way in order for you to do your work?
Oh, yeah, that was a 10-year, that was very critical that I had to slowly find and make friends with all of these people who were left, because so much of the research came from them, from their family albums and oral histories, and a lot of these people were getting very old, too, and a lot of them have passed away since I started the project, so it's very critical to find these people and interview them, because most of this stuff had never been documented. Most of the buildings had never been published. So there was not much in the archives in many cases. So you really had to find the people who knew the story. But anyway, I didn't finish your other question. Once the houses are restored, then we rent them in the summer to mostly people who are fans, who are enthusiasts of modern design. So a lot of architects and designers and just people who are fans.
Just mere mortals like us.
Mere mortals, yes. Muggles.
Muggles, yes, the Muggles. We're everywhere.
And then we do an artist and scholar residency in the spring and fall. So every year that changes. And at this point we pick a curator who picks the participants and then presents the work in some way. So that can be visual art. Sometimes it's architecture and design. But basically we do the residencies in the spring and fall to kind of keep the cultural mojo going of these weren't just, they weren't just vacation houses. They were actually, a lot of work happened in these houses.
So how can people book these houses and stay in them?
You can just go to our website, Cape Cod Modern House Trust, and there's a link that says Stay in a Modern House, and then you contact Victoria, and she helps you.
Is there a website? Is it all spelled out, Cape Cod Modern House Trust, or is it abbreviated?
You can Google ccmht.org, and it'll go there.
Okay.
Yeah. Or actually, almost any variation of Cape Cod Modern or whatever, we'll bring it up, yeah.
I remember the few summers, well, not summers, the few weeks I spent on Cape Cod, there was a really vibrant theater community in Wellfleet. Is that still going on?
Yes. Yep, we have 2 theaters. We have a small kind of black box theater, and then we have a larger theater, too, yes. That's been since at least the 60s, yeah.
And they're putting on all kinds of productions all summer long.
Mm-hmm.
I imagine.
Yeah, there's a big theater scene in Provincetown, too, but Wellfleet has its scene also.
So there's a great combination. Come up, rent a modern house, go to see all these plays, eat clam chowder all day. That sounds pretty good.
Yes. And as I say, Eugene O'Neill, Tennessee Williams, all these people were in Provincetown Mary Heaton Vorst, as well as Hans Hofmann had a school of painting, and Robert Motherwell. There's a lot of modernist history in the Outer Cape.
Now, do you have a favorite clam chowder place?
Yes,
George,
I
are
would
you
recommend,
hungry?
I am. I've been thinking about this ever since I wrote it.
I would recommend PJ's in Wellfleet. It's really the best.
PJ's. In the 70s, there was a place in Falmouth called Barnaby's that there were just lines out the door.
Mm.
And we went one summer, and I must have had 2 bowls a day easily. And we came back the next summer, and Barnaby's was all boarded up. It was gone. It was a really grieving moment for me.
You haven't recovered, I can tell.
I have not since then.
Well, there was a place in Orleans that was very famous for its onion rings, and it washed out to sea last year. So
the whole restaurant?
It was like a little shack on the beach,
Okay.
And we had 4 nor'easter storms in a row, and I think the last one took it out to sea.
Well, that's too bad.
So that's part of the inconstancy of life on Cape Cod.
Those sharks are getting some good onion rings right about now.
Yeah, or maybe the employees, yeah.
Peter, tell us about the book. You wrote this book in 2014, I think?
Mm-hmm.
What will people discover in the book about Cape Cod?
Everything.
Do you want to elaborate on that, Peter?
Yeah. Well, the book really is really equally a product of the collaboration with Christine Cipriani. She was an editor, and also Diana Murphy, who ran Metropolis Press. They were both editors, and then we had another editor. So the book was edited very thoroughly, and we approached this as sort of a series of short biographies of the people involved, and we sort of took turns writing those, and then we would sort of pass them back and forth, and that all became sort of the story. It's really the story of this sort of string of people who kind of were the most important actors in this whole situation, and we tried to make it very accessible. So there's very little jargon, and Christine is not an architect, and so
Another muggle.
A muggle, and so although she's writing a book now on Ada Louise Huxtable, the great architecture critic, so hopefully that'll be out before too long. Anyway, we wanted to make it, understandable to everybody, and I think it's succeeded quite well. But basically, it tells the whole story from the beginning up till sort of the mid-'70s and sort of late modernism and the beginning of postmodernism. And so we have a lot of the players in that whole scene were here as well. And also you can sort of tell the story of American architecture through these little vacation houses, which on their own are these little standalone structures, but each one of them is sort of an embodiment of a sort of philosophy of design, which was always changing.
And the book is called Cape Cod Modern, Mid-Century Architecture and Community on the Outer Cape.
Mm-hmm.
So, Peter, most people, I assume, are driving into the Cape, but you can fly to Boston and drive down, or you can fly into Provincetown, right?
You can fly into Provincetown, or you can take the ferry from Boston to Provincetown in the summer. In the summer. Which is a nice way to do it. There's a ferry from right near the airport.
How long does that take?
Oh, well, there's a fast ferry and a slow ferry. I can't tell you exactly.
So is it like hours and hours or 15 minutes? I don't know the scale of.
Oh, no, it's hours.
Hours and hours.
But it's faster than driving in the summer because the traffic is bad.
And I remember from childhood, there were these enormous ferries that worked between, I think, the Falmouth area and Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard. Mm-hmm. Giant car ferries. Are they still going?
Yeah, those go from Woods Hole, which is in Falmouth, and also from Hyannis.
And when it was foggy and you were out in a boat, you'd hear those things coming at you through the water. It was like the Titanic was getting ready to just hit you. It was one of the scariest things I've ever been in.
Mm-hmm.
Because that foghorn was loud, and we were in a 16-foot boat with no wind and the fog, waiting for doom.
Did you have a thermos full of chowder?
No. I did not.
Oh, that's probably
I don't believe
problem. You. Yeah, that is frightening then.
Well, Peter, this has been great. Thanks for joining us and telling us about the Cape.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. US Modernist Radio is underwritten by Angela Roll, your special agent for Modernist Houses. 919-995-0550. Okay, take us home, Aaron.
Visit USModernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover 7,000 classic modernist houses, and access 2.3 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. US Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Chief of Guest Research Cindy Stratton, not her real name, was spotted yesterday in Belize and says by the time you hear this, she will be long gone. US Modernist Radio is a production of Triangle Modernist Archive, a nonprofit educational organization for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Erin Sterling Lewis. George and Tom will be back next week with another edition of US Modernist Radio.
Thanks, Aaron.